Hello and welcome to Literary Notes, a podcast by the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. How do you get around town? For about 2/3 of Americans with driver's licenses, there's a pretty easy answer. But for folks who are disabled, lower income, unhoused, or elderly, the solution isn't always as simple. Disability advocate Anna Zivarts takes a look at this problem as well as potential solutions in her book, When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. In this episode, Zivarts sits down with library volunteer Betsy Haddox to talk about her book, the history of disability advocacy, and their favorite bus lines in Seattle. This was a very fun conversation to listen to in the booth, so I hope you enjoy.
Hi, this is Betsy Haddox, a volunteer at the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, and I'm here today with Anna Zivarts, who wrote When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. In addition to writing the book, Anna is a low-vision mom and non-driver who was born with the neurological condition nystagmus. Since launching the Disability Mobility Initiative at Disability Rights Washington in 2020, Zivarts has worked to bring the voices of non-drivers to the planning and policy-making tables through organizing, research, and policy campaigns led by non-drivers. Zivarts serves on the Pacific Northwest Transportation Consortium Advisory Board and the National Aging and Disability Transportation Centers Coordination Advisory Committee. So, obviously, you have lots of wonderful experience, which you shared in your book, and I'm really excited to talk to you about. Thank you so much for being here, Anna.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here and celebrate the audio release of the book.
Yeah, totally. I know. It's exciting. Let's get started. I've read the book. I thought it was wonderful. One thing that I think would be great to just start off with is talking a little bit about who the non-driver community is, because you discuss it in the book, and it's a bigger portion of the population than people might realize.
Exactly, yeah. So, I think maybe it's helpful for me to talk about how I came to sort of think about non-drivers as a community, maybe to set this up.
Yeah, sure.
So I grew up in Washington State. Grew up outside of Olympia, and growing up, I was not particularly connected to the blind or to the disability community.
Mm-hmm.
And really, when I turned 16, thought I would get a driver's license, tried to, wasn't going to happen. And so I wasn't really sure how I was going to live my life without driving, because in the place that I grew up, adults drove to get places, and that was sort of the norm. And so, then I moved to New York City, and living in New York City, I moved there intentionally because there was a subway, and I
totally
ran 24 hours a day, and I wanted to have that kind of like access.
Yes.
And it was normalized not to drive there, right? Because most people don't afford, unless you're pretty wealthy, you're not going to have a car in New York City. And so everywhere, none of my friends had cars. None of the places we went to, you needed to have a car.
Mm-hmm.
When you look up, directions to a doctor's office, it's the nearest subway stops. Like that's what's normalized.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of I didn't even think about transportation access for a couple of, and it wasn't a big part of my life for a long time.
Yeah.
And then when I moved back to Washington State in 2018, that's when I first sort of started. I was working for the disability community at that point, and met a bunch of other non-drivers at my workplace.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, wait,
Yeah.
there's actually, I thought there was, everyone in Washington State drove.
Yeah.
That's not true. This is so cool.
Yeah.
And then I started really reflecting on, in the work I'd done in New York and sort of the social justice work, how many people I knew actually who, even if they lived in car-dependent places, couldn't drive, like immigrants and low-wage workers. And I was like, wait a second, there's actually a lot of non-drivers. And so that's what sent me down this path to try to think about, it's not just people with disabilities who can't drive. It's also young people who are too young to drive, young people who are choosing not to get a driver's license because they can't afford to or it's too stressful. It's seniors who are aging out of driving. It's people who can't afford vehicles.
Yes.
And it's people who perhaps, have suspended licenses.
Right.
And either can't afford to get them unsuspended or, for whatever reason, don't have a valid, a legal way to drive. And so
Totally.
altogether, we're about 30% of the population here in Washington State, 31% in Wisconsin. Those are the two states that have done sort of statewide analysis of it.
Yeah.
And so, and nationally, it's probably about that too. It's, higher percentages of non-drivers in communities that are low income, communities that have a lot of people of color, tribal communities.
Yes.
But yeah, it's a big percentage, and I think it's a lot more than people think of.
No, you're totally right. It is a huge percentage when you talk about young people, old people, immigrants, people who don't have a license for whatever reason, all the reasons you've suggested. It's not surprising that it ends up being a third. And there was a point in the book, in addition to the data on Washington and Wisconsin, there's a part where you talk about across the U.S., this trend is,
Yeah.
I think really consistent most places. I know where I grew up in Denver, like I was really excited to get my driver's permit and like, to be able to drive and have a license. And it's kind of, I think for a lot of people like me who live kind of like a privileged, unburdened life in a lot of ways, like I just have, luck of who I am, that's possible, and it's kind of a natural progression as you grow up.
Mm-hmm.
And your book was so cool to read because I was reflecting when you were talking about all the people who aren't drivers. It also made me wonder, who are drivers? Who are these other people?
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, it's people who work. It's people who have jobs that they drive to. And it's like white people, it's wealthy people, it's people who have wealth from their family or like wealth built up over time. And you point out in the book, I think, you had this great line. I wrote it down. There's a thought in our society, I'm paraphrasing, there's a thought in our society that you're only as valuable as the hours you work, which I think is like really true and kind of gets to the core of it. And you can really see the intersectionality of how people who can't drive are maybe, because they can't drive or because they have a reason that they can't drive, also prevented from entering the workforce.
Yeah.
And the way that our society treats those people is just really horribly, generally, over the course of our society.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm overstating it to say
No,
people who are not contributing economically are treated really poorly in our society.
Discounted, right? And not considered to be like, have valid mobility needs then, right?
Yes.
Or, perhaps, as a society we say, okay, well, we're going to make sure that people can get to medical appointments if they can't drive. But that's about it often, right?
Yeah.
And all the other things that you might need or want to do to live a full life, like those can be really difficult. And even getting to medical appointments can be really difficult. So, I think that point around, who... when we sort of assume that everyone drives, what we're talking about is like who we see active in our communities, and that's a result of it's so difficult for people who don't have that driving privilege to be active, to not be stuck at home, to not be stuck in facilities.
100%. And it's something that, I've had a driver's license my entire adult life, but when I moved to Seattle, never bought a car. And now I can benefit from the occasional use of my partner's car. But it's interesting to grow up envisioning my life as a driver and then to choose not to do that, mostly.
Yeah.
Still have the privilege and safety net to be able to if needed, but to mostly choose not to and experience the stresses that come with that. Like on the way down here to the library today, I took the bus and I took the light rail, and it's these routes that I know really well, and I anticipated I was going to be here on time. And yet in the back of my mind, there was this uncertainty because you're in a little bit less control of your own mobility. Yeah. And, it's a question of, it is taking longer potentially to get there. Or there was, something that happened at the light rail station, something's delayed or whatever it is. And I did end up getting here a few minutes later than I thought I would. But in the end, I also have the privilege to take the extra time to create the buffer. And when I read in your book anecdotes about people who lose their job because they're late because of taking transit, it's not really their fault, right?
Yeah.
Like if they show up at the bus stop and the bus is late and they've kind of made this agreement with Big T Transit in the sky, like I will show up at the time and I'll be able to get to work, and then they can't. It really creates an unequal burden on people who don't drive.
No, and I think it's important, thank you for pointing out sort of and I say choice non-drivers and involuntary non-drivers and kind of make that differentiation in the book. But, to recognize that choice, sure, some people like perhaps have the ability to fully afford a car, but for other folks, it's like, owning a car is really expensive, and it's a trade-off. And especially if you live in an expensive city like Seattle and many cities in our country now, many communities, right, that the car ownership, sure, maybe you could take a big part of your household income and invest in owning a car and having that kind of mobility. But there are folks who are part of that sort of broader non-driver group of folks, non-driver coalition, right? That who maybe are kind of choice non-drivers, but kind of also it's an economic necessity as well. And so recognizing that there's not like a strict binary between involuntary and choice non-drivers, that altogether we have many things in common as far as what we can benefit from, and investments in transit reliability, transit coverage, sidewalks, crossings, locations, things near us that we want to get to, grocery stores, medical clinics, schools, work, right? All housing, affordable housing, right? These are all, we have a lot more in common altogether as a coalition of people who would like to not drive as much.
Yes. No, it is such a good point. And Anna, that leads to something else that I was thinking about when I was reading your book. So I actually didn't mention this to you before, but I'm an urban designer and landscape architect. And so I think a lot about sidewalks and I love sidewalks. And you point out in the book that in order to create greater mobility for people who don't drive, we will make changes that help everybody. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like let's say you're a power chair user and you're trying to go down a sidewalk and the sidewalk is broken. Like a tree root has happened and buckled the pavement, or maybe there's a bike share in the way, or there's some reason, or the sidewalk network isn't fully connected yet. There's some reason you can't be on the sidewalk and you're in the street. If you repaired or replaced or added sidewalk in these locations, it would totally help the power chair user, but it would also totally help everybody else. It would help me as a dog walker. It would help moms with strollers. It would help you if you're, taking your groceries home in one of those rolling carts behind you. Like, it helps people who are traveling and have luggage. It helps everybody to have this infrastructure. So it's really interesting that there's kind of a maybe like status and class symbol to driving, and people don't want to like invest in mobility that's open to everybody, because if you're using a type of mobility that's open to everybody, then maybe you can't use your mobility as a class status. But it still helps people of higher class statuses. No matter what, they're always going to benefit. But it just reminded me of how interesting that problem is. And an anecdote, or I guess it's not an anecdote, an example you refer to in your book is the Met-How trails.
Yes.
I think this was really interesting. Can you describe the Met-How trails for me? Because I'm not going to get it right. But I remember reading about it.
Yeah. So in Washington State, on the eastern part of the Cascade Mountains, there's a valley that's traditionally a farming valley. And that area, and I don't know the full history of it, but they started to build an off-road trail network for skiing in the winter and mountain biking in the summer. And now that network, and it's a place that I visited a lot as a teenager growing up. One of my friends had moved there when I was in middle school. And so, that area has become a super desirable area because of this off-road trail access. People want those recreational opportunities. And
totally,
it's a place I love to vacation because it means that if I am staying, somewhere along this trail network, I can get to like a coffee shop or a grocery store without having to be on this rural highway. And that's lovely. But housing values, especially housing values along this trail, are exorbitant because it's a premium. And it's frustrating because there are so many rural communities that would really benefit from having this kind of trail access, because there are many, many non-drivers in rural communities, seniors, folks who can't afford to drive. And we need to be investing more in places, safe and comfortable places for people to walk, roll, ride in these communities that aren't on these high-speed rural highways, that are not safe or comfortable places for community members to walk and roll. I want to provide a second example of a different, approach to this. So on the Yakima Nation in Washington State, so south of the Methow Valley, there's this tribal reservation, and there's a highway that runs through it, and it's one of the most deadly highways in our state. Because there are so many pedestrians and people walking, biking, rolling along this highway out of necessity to get in between communities or into town. And so the Yakima Nation is hoping to build out an off-road trail network to allow people that kind of mobility access without, being on this high-speed, uncomfortable, unsafe highway, right? Which nobody wants to be on a high-speed rural highway as a pedestrian. It's
totally.
So,
Well, and we didn't, oh my gosh, Anna, I can't believe we didn't talk about this earlier, because I think this is one of the things that makes you like such a cool icon for like this whole, I don't know, in this whole space. But like, you started the Week Without Driving Challenge. Is that right?
That is right. Yes.
Oh, that's so cool.
The Week Without Driving is so cool.
It's so cool.
And it's grown so much. It's just like, it's amazing to see where it's gone and where people are taking it. Like, I love being places and hearing about the cool things that people have done with that.
Absolutely. No, it's this really cool movement. If anyone listening to this hasn't heard of it yet, just look it up. It's really cool. But, people will, especially drivers who usually drive, will choose to do a week without driving. And I loved hearing the stories that you include in your book about people who usually drive saying, how would I do all of this stuff? And like, how would I do it? And also, would I want to do it? And it goes back to your point about these roads in the Yakima Reservation, or maybe in eastern Washington in rural communities, or in rural communities anywhere. Does anyone want to walk on the side of the state route where there's just a shoulder, and obviously it's unsafe, it's uncomfortable, you're buffeted by the gusts of passing vehicles, and maybe the weather is inclement. I mean, eastern Washington, I feel like it could be really hot or like really cold and snowy, or all of these things, and to not have a safe space, especially in crazy weather when drivers might not expect you, of course no one would choose to do that. And so Week Without, it's such a great example and a great opportunity for all people to reflect, like, what is our mobility fabric now, and is it actually enough? Does it actually serve us very well?
And I think the important part of it is, and what makes it different from some of the other activities like Car Free Day, or like Bike Everywhere Month, or Walk to School Day. Like, a lot of those ask people to take the trips that are, sort of joyful and comfortable and exciting, and like try to do those trips. And Week Without Driving really is like, take a week and take all the trips. As if you really didn't have that access to grab the keys and go that you do normally in your life. And I think it's those hard trips and uncomfortable trips that are the real learning opportunities, because that, those are the trips that point out the barriers and the gaps.
100%.
And, the things that we really have to change if we want people to have the option to be fully involved in our communities, even if they can't afford a car or can't drive. Or, So I think the other part of it, too, that I've been emphasizing is that, it's the elected leaders who participate in this. They're one of our main audiences to understand this, because they're the ones making decisions about transportation investments. And one council member from Kirkland, Neil Black, reflected in his sort of post-Week Without Driving interviews about what it meant for him to understand that he probably couldn't run for office if he couldn't drive, because there's so much expectation around being places quickly when you're campaigning or when you're an elected official, that without, driving yourself or having a driver, being able to afford, that, you probably wouldn't get elected in most parts of our country. And so as a result, we just lose the perspective of non-drivers as elected officials, because we're not set up to allow people to really be successful as elected officials without being able to drive. And so, that's a big gap in our knowledge. And that's why it's so important for elected leaders to at least have that 1 week of experience, right? Because then they see a little bit about what they don't know about how people in their communities, and guarantee every single community there are non-drivers, how people in their communities are navigating day in and day out.
100%. It's so interesting. I loved reading in the book about Week Without Driving and your ability to talk to leaders, elected leaders, and also, let's say, I think they're what you were discussing, being able to speak to different transportation secretaries, people leading different DOTs.
Yeah.
And their openness to this idea. They're understanding, once it's explained to them, maybe in a little more detail or with some more context, that things like the transportation network, from 50,000 foot view can change. It's like, yes, people can be advocating for themselves. And what support are we getting from our elected leaders, from people who are leading transportation departments and the like, to make those changes from the top down as well? I thought it was fascinating. Can you talk a little bit? You said you spoke to, or Roger Millar invited you, the previous Secretary of Transportation, and you were able to speak to some folks about your work and your research. Tell me a little bit about that experience. And I hope I didn't mischaracterize it, but I think it was, they were eager to hear what you were saying, right?
It was a group of different DOT heads from around the country. We're at an AASHTO meeting, which is American, oh my gosh, I'm going to mess up the acronym.
Oh my gosh.
American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials.
Yes.
There we go.
Anna, okay, yes.
A meeting in San Diego. And so I went and presented, some of the work that we'd done and the stories we'd collected from non-drivers in Washington State to that meeting. And I think I was going in expected to be written off. And I think having the weight of Roger's invitation to be in that space really sort of helped people understand that this was something to consider with seriousness, right? And so I think it comes down to a political question, though, often of, state highway officials, elected officials hear from drivers all the time, right? They hear from drivers, about pavement conditions, about congestion, about, all of, that we need to, whatever, there was this traffic jam, this light just takes too long, this backup, like they hear those voices all the time, and they're not necessarily hearing from people who aren't able to travel because the system isn't set up for them. Yeah. And so, taking that moment to sort of contemplate the voices that weren't in that room or aren't being heard, I think is important. And that's sort of, the point of the work. But I think Week Without Driving is a tool for us to start doing this organizing work, because it's going to take so much work for us, to try to convince people that, okay, sure, like sidewalks are important, but we're actually going to, invest in building those sidewalks, invest in repairing those sidewalks. Right. That's part of our street repaving. Right. That we can't just keep on, pretending it's not. Yes. So that takes tons of organizing, tons of local organizing. Yeah. And part of the joy of having this book in the world is being invited to come out and, speak to different communities and see what they're doing. Yeah. To try to make communities work better for people who don't drive or choose not to drive. And that's been exciting, because there is really great work happening all over the country, and people really pushing and pushing their local electeds and pushing their state and local transportation departments to do better. Yeah. And so it's nice to see that and be aware that it's, it's everywhere, and it's going to take a lot of work, but there are people doing it.
Yeah, totally. I agree. I think the book is it's great that you can, learn and speak to people through the book. And it's also great for those of us who read it to understand who our community is. I feel like, one of the first parts of organizing is like, who do I organize with? You know what I mean? Yep. Who do I bring to the table that we can all stand together and like make a strong message? Yeah. And you go through it in the book. And so it's beautiful. It makes me feel like there's a whole community of non-drivers, and we're not ever portrayed or discussed that way. Yeah. We're usually not thought of in like a single monolith of people with an interest, and we can be, we can. So it's really cool. I loved the example, of course, being from Denver myself. You wrote in the book about this protest that happened in Denver in 1980. I think it was a couple years after the ADA passed, but
before the ADA, but yes.
Oh, before the ADA. Yeah. Before the ADA. It was before the ADA. And the access on transit in Denver was really bad. Like, it was difficult or impossible. True, everywhere. I shouldn't harsh on Denver, but it was really difficult if you were in a wheelchair, say, or had some other mobility concern, to access transit and get on the bus. And I loved this story of people, I think in wheelchairs primarily, going in front of buses and stopping the buses
Yeah.
and demanding
Yeah.
access, demanding equity.
Yeah.
It was a story where I read it and I was like, oh, that's genius, like, and it just takes people, I think, standing together and identifying a need and going for it. And obviously bus services, I think, everywhere. And last time I was in Denver, I can attest, like, are
Wheelchair
much more.
accessible.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Like,
Yeah.
much
No,
more.
and it wouldn't have gotten there without a fight, right?
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's, as we build the movement, right, that's where what it might take, I think, to make change. I was just thinking this morning, I got word that this project that I've been pushing for, along with a lot of other community members for a long number of years, and we finally got some federal funding to study a potential solution. It's, if you're familiar with the Judkins Park light rail station that's getting built at the intersection of I-90 and Rainier, they're building this light rail station in the midst of a freeway median, and so in order to get to that light rail station, you have, as a pedestrian, to cross these unsignalized on or off ramps. And unfortunately, when the original project design happened, that wasn't really fixed.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to, before the station officially opens, at least come up with some ideas, to how could we make it more comfortable, especially for disabled pedestrians. Because if you're blind or low vision and you're trying to cross an unsignalized on-ramp, you have no sense of when it's safe to do that. And the cars are only going to stop if you step out.
Yes.
But, stepping out in front of a car that's exiting a freeway
Yes.
at highway speeds feels suicidal. And so, we had this federal grant after many years of advocacy, got a federal grant to try to come up with a potential solution because it is, a state highway and it involves a lot of different jurisdictions.
Yeah.
And that grant is on pause as of now because of the new administration. And I was just thinking, like, I mean, it's frustrating on many levels.
Yes.
But it also becomes a question of priorities because, sure, we, are using some federal funding to study a potential solution here, but it doesn't require federal funding. Our state could study a solution. Sound Transit could have, had the solution be part of the design of the original intersection.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a question of, are we going to prioritize fixing this before people get killed trying to access this light rail station?
Yeah.
And what would that take? And, even if you just have people crossing these on and off ramps frequently, the traffic backups are going to be intense for people trying to get off the freeway because there is no signal. So just, how do we get that prioritized? And that's a very concrete example of shifting resources and shifting whose access is priority.
Yes.
Is it the drivers or should it be people investing and using in this light rail system that we've built out to try to get people to reduce their driving?
Totally. It's ironic, right? That this tool, the light rail, which can reduce vehicular trips, which is beneficial for lots of reasons, is not accessible to people because of cars. Yeah. So it does go back. It's almost like, to what level are some of these improvements just half of the answer? How can we get the other half, which is true, actual, safe, reliable access to these resources? And are we ready to finally deprioritize?
And
cars?
that access has to be easier, right? For people who can choose to drive and who can afford to choose to drive, they're going to keep choosing to afford to drive as long as it's the fastest, easiest, safest, most convenient way to get places. And, the why New York City is the way New York City is that it's faster not to drive a lot of the time.
Totally.
Because there's so much congestion and it's, it just makes sense. There's a great subway system.
Yes. And it's so dense. You can walk a lot of places and absolutely.
And biking, if you have the option of biking, it's pretty much always faster than driving, right?
Yeah.
So that just, there's, we're not going to get to the place where we actually reduce car dependency without making it less convenient to drive than it is to, it has to be more convenient to walk, more enjoyable to take transit.
Yeah.
And those are political questions. So
yeah, they really are at the end of the day, which, it kind of gets to that point of, I think a lot of conversations people have had in the last 12 years in our country of how do you talk to people with different political views and form a coalition? And how do you not get really isolated from each other, really polarized? I think when it comes to mobility, if you look at examples like Met Howe trails in the Met Howe Valley and how having those trails, having those safe places for all kinds of people to be is actually really attractive to everybody. Like the evidence is there that the housing cost went way up.
Yep.
And
walkable cities too, right? I mean, people want that walk score, right?
Yes.
They want that, and that then becomes a premium. And then if you can't afford that, you're out in exurb with no sidewalks and no transit, and
it's this crazy. So what it makes me think of, Anna, is I was at a neighborhood association meeting a few years ago when I lived in the Ravenna area, and there was a huge turnout. Like I was going to these meetings regularly just to like listen about what's going on. It's total nerd, just like I'm going to show up at the neighborhood meeting and what's going on in the neighborhood. Most 20-somethings were not. I don't think any 20-somethings were there.
I'm glad you were there.
Except me. So I was just like a nerd in the corner listening. And no one would show up to these meetings, like ever, unless they had like a special interest thing they really wanted to say or something like that. But I remember there was this meeting, maybe there were a couple meetings where dozens of people showed up. And the reason, of course, was a bike lane was being proposed. That was part of the city bike master plan. It was about to be installed. And at the time for comment a couple of years ago when the plan was being developed, folks living in the neighborhood didn't provide lots of comment. I think there are times in the design phase of things where like usually people are brought in, they can provide comment, and usually people who have privilege, let's say people who are drivers, have the opportunity to comment and have their voice heard. But this bike lane was about to be installed, and it was going to remove the street parking in front of their houses on 35th, and they were in an uproar. Yeah. And I remember being at this meeting and hearing people talk about, what am I going to do? How am I going to bring my groceries in if I can't park like right out front of my house? And as someone who didn't have a car, I was like, what do you mean? How are you going to bring your groceries in? Like, you're going to do what I do. At that time, I took the bus to go to the grocery store usually. There was another grocery store that was a little smaller and more expensive kind of nearby, and I could walk to that one, but it made more sense for me to take the bus to a grocery store and then get off a couple blocks away and walk. Yeah. And when you're walking with groceries, sometimes those items are bulky or heavy or whatever it is, or you're like having people over and you have like sodas, you know what I mean? Like it's not convenient, and sometimes it's raining and whatever. I guess I said it's not convenient. It's maybe not comfortable, at least the way I was doing it. I didn't
have the grocery cart.
I didn't have the grocery cart.
The grocery cart
that
was a game changer. I didn't realize it until I got a stroller with my kid, and then I was like, now I just use it for groceries.
Yes,
it's so nice.
Yes. Okay.
People need to if you live in New York or in other cities, you see
everyone has a grocery cart.
Everyone has a grocery cart.
Yes.
That's how you do grocery shopping, because otherwise you're like cutting off your finger circulation trying to like schlep bags home. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You're totally right. I mean, it was youthful idiocy. I didn't have a grocery cart.
Well, and it's like a culture of not driving that we just don't have that experience growing up. Like for those of us who grew up in households with cars, like my parents didn't have a grocery cart, right? Like so. Yeah.
But anyway, it just reminded me, of these folks saying, "Oh, you're going to take away my parking to put in a bike lane." And it was truly a sense of ownership of the street in front of their house. Yeah. But as someone who thinks about the public realm, and obviously you do too, and just mobility of the population in general, I think it's really important to remember for everyone, the right of way is a public resource. Yeah. And drivers don't have a right to park. Yeah. That, I think, when it comes back to our discussion of, mobility being a political question, I feel like that is one of the huge hurdles, a sense of ownership over the public right of way. Yeah.
And the status quo, too, is also just like people don't want to talk about, and you want to change anything, and there's like, oh my gosh, this will impact these people. But it's like the status quo also has really disparate impacts. Yes. And we don't talk enough about who doesn't get to, leave their home if there's no bus stop or sidewalk. Right?
So true.
Like, sure, maybe if you install a sidewalk on this block, it will reduce some parking availability in the public right of way. But without that sidewalk, who's not participating at all? So
100%.
I get
100%. I think we could both probably get fired up about it. It's
fun to get to talk about this.
Totally.
Yeah.
what it also makes me think of is, I think you mentioned this. I mean, you mentioned it in the book. I just don't remember where. And maybe you didn't mention this specifically, but you mentioned at some point, there's metrics for counting drivers. And I think of those cords, whatever those are, that they lay across a street and the cars drive over them. And there's metrics, there's data about car trips. And as, someone who's thinking, how do we talk about making a change in our society? It seems like, and you've done wonderful research in the book and you've collected a lot of data, but there's also missing data, right? There's missing data about pedestrians or people who use wheelchairs or power chairs or different bikes or all kinds of things to get around. One interesting piece of data, and it seems like King County Metro is kind of at the forefront of some of this kind of open thinking about how to increase mobility. But I believe it was a King County Metro pilot program you mentioned in the book where for folks who qualified, they didn't have to pay fare maybe to get on the bus. And the amount of trips in that group of people doubled.
Yes. Yeah.
I thought that was fascinating. I mean, that's just one piece of data to show that there are people who are craving more mobility, who need more mobility for whatever reason. In this case, it was economically unfeasible for them. But there are people out there who want to be more mobile and who are unable to be. Yeah. And there's no data. So how do we piece this together? Or, what do you, I don't know. I mean, you talk about it in the book.
Untaken trips, right? I mean, I think that's a huge piece of, I mean, there's both the cost piece, there's people's fear about, there's a lot of trips I don't take in the evenings or, I just don't, and it's because of the sort of discomfort from, a whole host of different factors. So many, and I think, and then just all the metrics that we use for measuring trips tend to undercount chain trips. They tend to undercount trips that are perhaps partially taken walking or rolling and then combined with transit. Todd Littman at Victoria Transport Institute, VTPI, Victoria Transportation Policy Institute. Should double check that acronym. We could just leave it at Todd Littman. Has done wonderful research on, how much these trips are undercounted and then as a result underfunded, right? And the way we fund. And those are existing trips, not even counted the trips that, what you're getting at, like the trips that aren't taken. Yes. Because of that, there's sort of the induced demand of driving, and it's the opposite of that, right? When riding transit or walking or rolling is too much of a burden, people are reducing trips in the same way we increase our trips when there's a highway and it's super easy and fast and we can drive somewhere and boom, the opposite happens as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's so fascinating to me, and you talk about this in the book. To me, as someone who uses transit, I think the biggest change for me would probably be an increased frequency of buses coming along each route, because you're never, well, maybe you can, but I was about to say you're never going to be able to have a perfectly timed bus. Yeah. Maybe you can with bus lanes and dedicated, I think there's ways to make this efficient. And I think, boarding at multiple doors, for example, or, we've seen some changes that I think are improving the reliability of bus schedules. But when it comes to just frequency of bus trips, I think that's maybe for a lot of people the answer, because then if you miss a bus or a bus is early or late or whatever it is, the next one is still close and you're not having to plan these huge amounts of time on either side of your trip to account for that. It makes, I mean, what you're saying, I don't, maybe you don't take trips at night, things like that. I've had that experience too. At nighttime, maybe you are less safe. Or if you miss the bus and frequency is reduced in the nighttime hours, maybe typically a bus that comes every 10 or 15 minutes only comes half an hour. Yeah. And if you get there 5 minutes early, but the bus has passed for some reason, you're waiting maybe 45 minutes for the next bus, because what if the next bus is a little late? Yeah. And then you're just standing outside in the dark. Not
often a comfortable place to be.
No one would choose that. Yeah. So when I talk to people I know who are drivers and are reluctant to take transit, sometimes it's hard to make the compelling argument to them. Of course you should do this, because they're I've had that experience. I think many of us have. Probably everyone who takes transit regularly has had that experience.
Happened to me just
all
the
time.
Night. And it wasn't even, it was 7:30 at night downtown. It wasn't even, but there was a ghost bus. And so I thought it was coming in 15 minutes and it didn't show up. And I was there with my kid. Yeah. And, someone was having a crisis at the bus stop. And I finally called an Uber because I was like, I don't feel comfortable waiting here. Yeah. And it's only 7:30 at night.
Yes.
So, but, and I had the privilege to be able to call an Uber and, not have to wait for a wheelchair accessible taxi to show up, which would have been, so it's funny. I'll tell one other sort of frequency story, but when I took my kid to New York, which is where he was born, to visit family last summer before, and I remember us going down to the train. He's like, "Oh, when is it coming? Do we need to plan?" And it comes every 3 minutes, and it just blew his mind that you could just go to the subway and you didn't have to think about when it was coming. And it just I know frequencies I think have reduced a little bit from when pre-pandemic, but when I was living in New York City, I remember you'd take the night overnight 3 a.m. trains, and they'd be every 20 minutes, and it was like, God, I have to wait 20 minutes, and now I'm like, 20 minutes, that's what I have to wait all the time for the bus.
All the time, totally. Yeah.
So it's just, it is possible to have frequent transit.
Of course.
And it does change so many calculations, especially when you're chaining trips, right? Because in New York, sure, you're not probably going to be able to take one train line always to go where you want to go, but the frequencies are such that transferring is not this huge penalty the way it is here often when, the timing is inevitably messed up.
Yeah.
And so chances are you're going to have a pretty significant layover.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It is truly crazy. I want to ask you about, what are other responses aside from using our existing system the way it is? You talked about microtransit in your book, and that's something that I'm really not familiar with, but I think microtransit and VIA or VIA or something, I can't remember. Can you talk a little bit about these other ideas that are out in the world and what you think about that?
Yeah. I am skeptical about on-demand transit being able to scale at the capacity we need it to scale, especially in denser areas, which is, ultimately going to provide us more access. And so perhaps there's communities where smaller on-demand shuttle pickups make sense, but the math just doesn't work very well. The second you have 2 people instead of 1 people, that time doubles, and what the number of vans you need doubles. We're fixed route transit. There's a bit more ability to scale. So, I think what gives me more excitement and more hope is electric mobility devices like e-bikes, e-scooters, cargo bikes, family bikes, accessible trikes, recumbent, this whole universe of devices that has become increasingly affordable and available to people. And how do we make them available to more people? Part of that is cost, but a lot of it is the infrastructure, both the safe places to roll, but also places to park and charge that 100%. Are secure and roll in. You can't carry a cargo bike or an accessible trike up a step or 2, right? It's not, and so you need a roll-in place where you live. Yeah. And that doesn't exist a lot of places. We had to dig a ramp down to our basement to be able to. Did. Yeah, and I'm lucky we live in a house, we own it, so we could, you can do that, take a sledgehammer to the stairs and turn it into this ramp. But otherwise we wouldn't have secure parking for our e-bike. Yeah. Because there's no way that's going up and downstairs.
Yeah, totally.
Carrying it.
Totally.
So,
no. You're right. A lot of these mobility options are bulky or heavy or, and also, as you point out in your book, expensive and valuable to steal. Yeah. So it's a highly vulnerable piece of equipment to have with you. And so, having a secure place, even to have it, at a light rail station, at a bus stop, whatever, maybe you're making a trip in multiple parts and you have to be able to get this equipment with you. Yeah. What is the answer? Yeah.
No, and it's tricky, because how do you can't easily bring them on transit, but if you need to chain, chip train, just many, many questions. Yes. I think there's also, other models of shared, devices, but as of now, those devices sort of work for single person who's not needing an accessible device. Yeah. Traveling by themselves, right?
Yeah, totally.
And not carrying groceries. And
yeah, it makes me think of someone, we'll continue with Seattle as the example since that's where we are, but it makes me think of someone who's working in tech or at one of these big firms who, maybe lives, over by Queen Anne or Fremont or Cap Hill or something like that, and they can use their electric scooter to zip down to South Lake Union for their job. That's what the products on the market seem to be tailored for. Right?
And at $1 a minute, that's a rate that for many folks is just gonna, especially if you're not, it just isn't sustainable.
100%.
So
100%.
Yeah, I love, in the docked systems, I think are a much, in the ones that are subsidized, through city governments, like the ones in New York or DC, I've used. I think they're pretty great.
Yeah.
As a tourist, especially when you want a bike, you're
Sure.
like, it's here and it's very affordable.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think and it is exciting. There's a lot of, sort of, even though there's perhaps less sort of investment in that space, there's still changes happening. And I was just at an e-bike summit in Minneapolis, and there was some really exciting conversations going around about bike libraries, cargo bike libraries, family bike libraries.
Wow.
So that people can try out the devices before because that's the only way you are like, oh, this is going to work for me, and I'm going to invest in making this work.
That is really true. That is really true. It's almost like, a week without driving. It's like week with a cargo bike. Like, what does it look like to make all my trips with this? And what a good idea, because it is a big investment to get any of those. Yeah, it's interesting. I think your book raises a lot of questions about where are the deficiencies, what are some options for improvement, and it's almost like there's a huge gap in service. There's a huge gap in service, and there's kind of this there's a fractured kind of mess of solutions that are all kind of trying to overlap and help each other, but there's not a big solution yet.
And that's fine. I don't think there's gonna be. I think it's fine to have a lot of, solutions are gonna look different for everyone, right?
Exactly.
Like, there's not gonna be one kind of mobility that's gonna work. People have different access needs, different destinations, different income levels, different
100%.
desires as far as travel. But
yes, 100%.
Yeah, I would just say one thing, because, many people listening to this are probably blind or low vision. There are a lot of blind and low vision people who bike for transportation or recreation. And so I think there's often this sort of like stigma against biking in the disability community and parts of the disability community. So just to say that if, and there shouldn't be, that bike advocates have a lot of work to do to be more welcoming for the disability community. But also, if you're someone who's blind or low vision in bikes, you should feel welcome. Yeah, you should feel welcome in the disability community and know that there are many other folks out there that do bike for recreation and transportation or want to be able to. And
that's beautiful.
Seek out that community.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. That's something I'm not familiar with, so I'm really glad you brought it up. And I think, interesting, like different advocacy groups. I think you do a really good job in the book of kind of treading this line of not losing your impassioned stance on the need for mobility equity, and at the same time not alienating, like other people who you need to collaborate with to make changes. I think to your point, like kind of a mosaic of solutions is, I think, probably going to be the answer. And for example, the answer isn't no driving or totally remove people's cars or driving ability. As you point out, lots of people who have disabilities, let's say, drive and rely on cars or, I think in my perfect future, I would almost always use transit, but then have a car available or something, if I don't have a personal car, have some other vehicle like that available, an Uber, whatever, so that if I'm like carrying something for a presentation and whatever the reason, you know what I mean? Like that is easily available and reliable. And when you have both, you have a resiliency in your mobility network that makes your life easy and comfortable and free. Yeah. And so, I think it's possible, right? To like all
I think it is too.
Find common ground on it.
I think it is. And I think, part of it is where I feel like I have the most hope is I do think we need to be organizing super local, hyper locally. Yeah. And, it's easy to sort of on social media connect with people that agree with you across the world. Totally. And you're like, these people are all in my camp. But do you talk to your neighbors? Do they understand how you get around? Do you understand how they get around? Yeah. What the barriers they experience, why they drive or don't drive, and who the, people within their household who maybe drive or don't drive, like really understanding each other at that hyperlocal level, because it's, your neighbors that are going to be at the community council meeting. Yeah, and it's, really true. It's that's where we can start to really have those conversations and understand. Yeah, I mean, it's nice to be able to be on, like social media and be like, oh yeah, everyone wants transit. Yeah. We need to be doing the work, with our neighbors too.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I wanted to, at the end of the book, you mentioned the block party you have on your blog. And I wanted to bring that up because you have a section in your book at the end where you talk about things people can do. And I encourage everyone listening to this to like check out the book and listen to it. And there's a lot of good ideas from Anna. But the block party is not listed as a thing you can do. But when I was reading, I was like, oh, this inspires me. It makes me want to do a block party.
Yeah.
And kind of reclaim the street as public space and also get to know your neighbor and understand their lives and their patterns and what works for them. Do you have block parties in the winter on your blog?
We don't. And this is actually something I posted about on social media recently because, you know, it is dark, it is cold. But no one on my block has a house that's, you know, capable of hosting the block. And there aren't any community spaces, really, that we can get, you know, as cheaply, easily, frequently, like just be like, oh, we're all going to show up here and get to see each other during the winter. And so I don't talk to my neighbors during the winter. And it was making me really sad the other day because I was like, I need to put in my permit request for our summer block parties. But you know, I think it's something that we're missing, and part of our built environment are those community spaces. Like if we had a rec center or, you know, even like restaurants that aren't just bars, right? And which is kind of what there is in my neighborhood. It would be big enough to host you know, a neighborhood.
A neighborhood, totally.
A street, totally. So, you know, I don't have a solution for winter.
Well, oh no, that's okay. I was kind of hoping you'd say yes, and I'd be like, wow, you guys are so cool. I think it would be really hard to hold a block party in winter.
So there was like this past Halloween, the city made it really easy to get permits for Halloween.
Oh, cool.
So I got one, but then it was torrentially raining, and it was like dark and stormy, and I was like, well, we could host it in our carport maybe, but it's pretty grimy, and like nobody really wants to hang out in like a moldy, drippy carport, and like
totally. I understand.
That's I think
well, that's I mean, there's you know, challenges to having block parties throughout the year in the Pacific Northwest, but I love the idea. You talk about other things like taking care of your sidewalk and school drop-offs and all kinds of stuff, which I appreciate. I think it's the last couple lines of your book. You say something like, who isn't in the room and what would it mean to change that? What would it take to change
get
that?
them there?
And I think that's a beautiful thing for us all to just consider in our life, you know, in all aspects of our lives. You know, who are we hearing from? Who are we not hearing from? And what can we do? Because I think when it comes to non-drivers, even like as a driver, I'll call myself a driver. As a driver, I know people who are non-drivers. You know what I mean? It's not like anyone in our society, I think, is isolated in a social pocket of only drivers. Like that's crazy. Like that's not possible. So I love the idea of just thinking more as the future goes on about non-drivers and, you know, all the benefits to everybody that come with better serving people with different mobility needs. Anyway.
No, I mean, I think it's a really good question to ask people, because even if you are in a position where you don't have a lot of decision-making power, you know, you feel like it's still possible to sort of look around the spaces where you are in and think about who's not there, right? And try to figure out how to make that a little bit different.
Thank you so much for bringing that like sense of inclusivity to your book and your work and things like that. I think that's a beautiful place for us all to start. And to close out the interview, Anna, I was kind of saving this question for the end.
Okay.
I'm hoping you're interested. I was wondering, could we just like gossip/gush for a second about like favorite bus routes or least favorite or favorite transit modes?
I mean, so I live on the 7 bus in Seattle, which is a workhorse, and there's like, you know, moments of real beauty on the 7. The other day, some guy like handed my kid a book that I think had gotten from a free library just as we got off the bus. That was really very sweet.
That is sweet.
Yeah. I would also say the 7, I was just in Minneapolis, and the 7 there is the bus that goes out to the park where they have cross-country skiing in the winter.
Ooh, nice.
So it's the ski bus, which is pretty cool. So the 7, 7 has my heart. But yeah, what is your...
7, I love that. Honestly, the King of Kings for me in bus world in Seattle is the King County Metro 62.
Mm.
The 62 is maybe a workhorse. The 62 is just this slow, rambly bus that goes so many places. It like starts up by Magnuson Park and weaves its way kind of a lot through North Seattle, and then like crosses down and comes through like into downtown. And the 62, in my experience, because I'm usually traveling more than a few stops, it will take a very long time to get where you're going, but it is always going to get you there. This is like my sweet little reliable tortoise, you know, the tortoise and the hare.
Yep,
like the
yep.
62 is my lovely tortoise who I love.
I'm going to shout out one other one.
Yeah,
which
do
is
it.
the 50. Doesn't run super frequently. Wish it ran more frequently.
Yeah.
But it goes from Seward Park to Alki. So in the summer, it's our beach bus. And it does take a very long time.
Yeah, east-west connections
The
are
east-west
hard.
connections are really,
Yeah.
yeah. But I love that there's a beach bus, and there's
Yeah.
something so
Oh, the
magical
beach
about
bus.
showing up at Alki, which I think is one of my favorite public spaces in Seattle.
Yeah.
It just feels, it feels warm and lovely
Yes,
in the summer.
100%. 100%. Beautiful.
But yeah, buses are great, and it really, I think, there is so much stigma, and so anything we can do to sort of push back against that stigma, I think is really helpful, because there's a sense of community too that I think happens in a bus,
Yes.
that we don't think about, and I think some of that really broke down during the pandemic, which was hard
Yeah.
and made riding the bus really hard.
Yeah.
But I think it is building back.
Yeah.
And there's a level of care, because it's sort of this, small contained environment where everyone in that bus, knows and recognizes each other as,
Yes.
people. And I think, there's a way, it's really healthy for us to interact with people who are
Yeah.
different from us in a city and be in shared spaces. And I think buses can be that. And yeah,
100%. It's so true. Buses are one of those places where you're going to be mixing with people who you maybe wouldn't. Like,
Yep.
I take the bus to go to the gym.
Yep.
And like people who go to the gym are gym people. Like
Yep.
they're gonna be at the gym.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
And like a lot of them drive
Yeah.
to the gym.
Yeah.
And like who am I meeting on the bus to the gym versus the bus to come down to the library versus the bus to go to the grocery store or whatever it is. It's different people, different times of day, different neighborhoods. They have different demands on their lives, and they have different demands than I do, you
Yep.
know? And so being able to like see them in society, acknowledge their presence, acknowledge their right to mobility.
Yeah. Because
And to
where
be-
else in Seattle, like, do you have that, where
Yeah.
we're actually together in a space?
Yeah.
I don't.
Totally. Yeah.
So,
Anyway,
get on the bus.
buses are rad.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Anna, what a lovely conversation. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. Nathan, I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, but I'll just say this was a conversation about when driving is not an option, steering away from car dependency by Anna Zivarts, which is in the collection soon at the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. So Anna, thank you again so much. What a pleasure.
Thank you. And maybe I'll just add real quick where to
please.
find me and find our
Oh,
work.
Please,
Yes.
please tell
So,
everyone.
you can find me. I'm on LinkedIn, Anna Zivarts, or Blue Sky at Non-Driver. And those are good places to find me. You can find out more about Week Without Driving at weekwithoutdriving.org.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what I'll share. So thank you.
Beautiful.
It's really exciting to be here and to celebrate the upcoming release of the audio version of the book.
Yay!
Yay.
Thank you for
Yeah.
being here.
Thank you.
For sure.
When driving is not an option, steering away from car dependency will be available in our catalog as an audiobook with the class ID DBC30189. We'll let you know in a later episode when it becomes available. If you have any questions or comments about the library, or to see if you qualify for our services, visit WTBBL.org, or call us Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. at 206-615-0400, or toll free at 800-542-0866. This episode of Literary Notes is a production of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, based in Seattle, Washington. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. Thanks for listening.